and good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Strictly History. I'm Katie,
I'm Allison.
and today we'll be talking about the Peaky Blinders series. Since season 6, which is the last season of the series, came out this past June.
Sounds right.
Yeah, this past June, we figured we'd talk about the Peaky Blinders as a whole, since they weren't really like this mob family that's depicted in the series in Birmingham. They were actually just a very large group of boys, essentially. Boys and young men in like the Midlands and Birmingham, in like the lower class areas of industrialized England, that were pretty much just running cons and being thieves and hooligans, as you know, the terminology goes. But there are certain theories about why they were called the Peaky Blinders, and I got most of my information I got from the website historic-uk.com, and it's a website that has articles that are related to English history. I've used them before, but one of the theories is that Peaky Blinders derive from the use of the cap to disguise their faces from the victims so they could not be identified, which makes sense because the caps that they wore were these cloth caps that had a large brim, and if you tugged it down over your face low enough, and if it was dark, you wouldn't be able to see their faces at all, which makes more sense than the razor hole and razor blade sewn into the cap, the brim of the cap, because back in the 1870s, which is when the Peaky Blinders would have been far more active, rather than in like the 1920s where the series is being depicted in, the disposable razor blades were far too expensive for lower class, middle and lower middle class people to actually afford, or even if they did have them, they wouldn't waste them sewing them into the brim of their caps to slash at people's eyes in order to rob them. So
were straight razors the go-to then?
Well, the disposable.
Not the disposable ones, but like I'm talking like the Sweeney Todd.
If they did use weapons, it would
not weapon, just for shaving. I meant.
Oh, just for shaving. Yes, then the straight razor would probably have been the go-to thing if they couldn't afford the newer disposable razors. Or if they could afford it, they would probably go to a barber and get that done professionally, if they could afford to do it, rather than do it themselves. I think most men at the time did it themselves, though.
Yeah, there is a scene in season 1 where he's shaving his face. I don't think he's not using the disposable razors. So
no, and it's interesting that that a series based in a time in history where disposable razors were plausibly used, that he wouldn't use it, especially if he had the money to afford to do it. We're also talking about Tommy Shelby, who's played by Cillian Murphy. Very well, I don't want to say very well, but very like...
He does a really good job.
He does a great job, doesn't he?
Yeah.
Yes, the dark hair, blue-eyed, black Irish, not hard on the eyes at all. Just wanted to point that out there. And so, I mean, like the name Peaky Blinders is really based off of slang terms of the time. So, like, peaky for the peaky cap that they would wear low on their face to hide their identities, and the local slang at the time using blinder as a description for someone looking particularly striking in appearance. So these weren't men or young men, boys who, what they were just gangs of men, young men, boys who were really on hard times. They weren't part of like the upper class, so most upper class gentlemen wouldn't be part of regional gangs anyway, but they presented themselves in a way that would make them rather what's the word I'm looking for? Unassuming. Like if you were to walk past them on a street in the evening hours where lights are sporadic and you're leaving a tavern, someone's coming up on you and they're well dressed.
Yeah.
You wouldn't think twice of it until it was too late.
Yeah,
and
I mean,
you were attacked.
The way like I looked at it is like they were always dressed like they were businessmen, because that's also what they saw themselves as.
Yeah.
And I don't know how accurate that is to the real gang, whether or not they saw themselves as businessmen the way they do in the show.
Right. I mean, most of the men that were arrested by police, if they were arrested at all, were arrested for racketeering, thievery, assault.
Yeah, I saw there was a lot of assault.
Yeah, a lot of assault. And so, yeah, I think the whole businessman outlook that's portrayed in the show is more for the drama of the show. It's like, because like I said at the beginning of this episode, is that they were not a mob family. There wasn't like one family dictating to an entire gang, what to do, where to strike, who to, put out protection for. They were very much just a large group of like, I don't want to say disassociation.
Yeah, well, from what I read, it seemed like they were very loosely organized.
Yes.
That it was more so that there might have been separate gangs that eventually they just started working together and kind of became one loose entity.
Yeah, and if they had, that's exactly right. And I mean, the origins of the gang and others similar to it came from the poor living conditions and economic hardships which dominated industrial England during the late 19th and early 20th centuries. The slums of Britain, particularly in the Midlands and northern England, were faced with large-scale deprivation and poverty for young boys and men not in work and with little job prospects. Pinching, mugging, and criminal acts became a way of life.
Yeah, I thought it was interesting too, because it seems like in reality the age is skewed a lot younger than they show in the show.
Absolutely. Yeah. I think too that if a show depicted young boys participating in a gang, I don't think it would go over very well.
Yeah, I mean, I saw, I can't talk today.
It's okay.
I saw a mugshot of, he was probably like 11 or 12.
Yeah.
Being arrested for, I don't remember what.
Yeah.
But gang-related activities. And they don't, as far as I know, as far as I've watched, they don't really show that in the actual show. Like, the youngest brother, he's probably like 10 years old, and he's kind of just there, at least in season 1. He's not really doing anything.
Right. And I mean, Finn doesn't actually become an active part of the gang until probably season, at the end of season 2 into season 3, because he's portrayed as being much older.
Yeah.
Like a younger, like an adolescent man. So, yeah, clearly the show wanted to set up an age range that would have probably been more appropriate for a gang.
Yeah.
Also, the time in which the gang was, the Peaky Blinders, was being portrayed in is completely inaccurate.
Yeah.
It's not, in season 1, you start in like 1920 Birmingham, where everything that I've read about the Peaky Blinders, and everything I've seen, history-wise about the Peaky Blinders, they've all been more active in the 1870s.
Yeah.
And they started to like peter out going into the early 20th century, so the early 1900s.
Yeah, from what I read, it seemed like by World War I, they kind of were just not really doing anything as a group anymore. And then especially, it seemed like once they started trying to get into bigger ventures, like the horse racing, was when other gangs kind of drove them out of Birmingham, at least, and they didn't stay together in other locations.
No, there certainly wasn't honor among thieves, as it were. Like, there wasn't, like how the show portrays loyalty, family loyalty. There certainly wasn't that, because there were all smaller gangs that kind of like joined together to make this one larger gang, so that they all could like benefit from whatever they were doing of the time, or like if there was a turf war, then they would all come together and fight this other gang for the territory that they saw as theirs, especially in Birmingham and the Midlands. So I mean, like, economic deprivation had led to criminal activity, but these young criminals quickly used extreme violent methods, which included assaulting their victims and, in some cases, stabbing or strangling. Fun.
Not great.
No. And, I mean, that's very much tame to what the show portrays, because the show obviously portrays beatings, but like we had said, with like the razor blade sewn into their caps, which is not a thing. But there are also like firearms involved and other uses. So they upped the violent ante, as it were, in the show. Again, I think more so just to create drama.
Yeah, and I guess because in the show, most of the gang members are at least in their 20s, 30s, you know.
Yeah.
More violence doesn't seem out of the norm compared to what you would see teenagers doing if they were portrayed that way in the show.
Right. And it's like, so the Peaky Blinders emerged from the area of Small Heath in Birmingham. We've talked about Birmingham. With the first reported activities detailed in a newspaper in March 1890, which described the brutal assault on a man by a gang known as Peaky Blinders. This is when we first start really seeing them actively pursuing victims. And it says 1890. So we can already see that the time frame in which the Peaky Blinders are being portrayed in the show is inaccurate.
Yes.
And
pretty inaccurate.
Yeah, and I think I find it interesting what the show did for at least like the Shelby brothers, who are the supposed like family, like the mob. It's like the mob in the Midlands and Birmingham. Like, they were all fighting in World War I. Their government let them down. Their government. So now it's like their vengeance, as it were, for lack of a better term, to get back at their government to make their lives better. Because in Birmingham, we see the economic deprivation, the extreme poverty, the slums. Everyone's like pretty much living hand to mouth. So it's like a stick it to the man kind of a mentality that's being portrayed in the show. Yeah.
I did find it like really interesting, like the time period change, because like the difference between 1890 and 1920, like it's a difference of 30 years, but a lot changed in those 30 years.
Yeah.
You know, industrially, and then World War I had a big impact on Europe, and especially on the characters in the show. You know, like you were saying, it changed a lot of their motivations, you know, and made them more comfortable with violence in a way they probably weren't before the war.
Yeah.
You know, you see a lot of PTSD episodes.
Well, especially with Arthur Shelby. I have such sympathy for that character. My heart breaks every time he like has an episode of PTSD, and it's like because they're in a time where no one understood what PTSD was. He couldn't get the help that he needed or that would have required of him to actually be better. It's it's really heartbreaking. And I mean, even with Tommy as well, who takes opium at the beginning of season 1 in order to like combat the dreams he's been having with his own PTSD. So I mean, it's you feel so much sympathy for these characters. You want them to succeed when they probably shouldn't.
Well, you know, you often root for the main characters of a show, whether or not what they're doing is right.
This
That's just
true.
how it is. And I mean, they're portrayed sympathetically too, because you see what they're going through.
Yeah.
You know, if you saw it from an outside perspective, maybe you wouldn't root for them.
Right.
But it's about them, and you watch it from their point of view.
Yeah. It's very, very true. And I mean, as we're talking about aging, like ages in the gang, in the late 1800s, these gangs were made up of a variety of ages, varying from as young as 12 up to the age of 30. It was not long before the group's ganged organization through informal hierarchies. So there were informal hierarchies, but nothing that like what Tommy Shelby becomes like the head of the family, and he's the one that you go to if you're in trouble or if you need help or if something goes wrong. So the whole like family loyalty and honor among thieves is not prevalent in reality. It's all informal. It's no one is really like the ringleader of anything, unlike that's what's portrayed in the show. Like for example, Thomas Gilbert, who became known as Kevin Mooney, who was considered to be one, if not the most prominent member of the Peaky Blinders. And I don't know if anyone can see, but that's Thomas Gilbert right there. But yeah, he's an older man, probably in his 30s.
Yeah, looks right.
Yeah. I mean, the location of it is somewhat correct.
Yeah. And I felt like too, even though the time period is not very accurate to when the gang would have been active, but the time period that they set it in, I felt like they did a really good job at portraying how it would have been. And I think it was an interesting time period, you know, to place the gang in.
Absolutely.
Because not only, you know, was there the consequences of World War I, the consequences of the Bolshevik Revolution in Russia.
The rise of communism.
Yeah.
Not only in Italy, but or fascism, I should say. But there were fascist and communist groups in England after World War I, because again, like the dissatisfaction that soldiers, ex-soldiers from World War I, that were not given either pensions from their service or who were simply brushed aside because of what they were told to do during the war that the government didn't want anyone knowing about because it would have been an embarrassment. It's all like coming to a head, as it were.
Yeah. And I think it's always important to recognize too that it's like, obviously there are, prior to World War I, there are people who have fought in wars before, and there would be veterans around, but the way warfare changed in World War I, you know, would have consequences that people wouldn't have seen before.
Trench warfare was new. The machine gun was new. What else? The mustard gas. I was just going to say the gas bombs.
Yes, I mean, the injuries that people are suffering after the war, you know, there's nothing really like it before. And
No.
there's not really resources to deal with it very well.
Yeah. What I find interesting too is that the show did a very good job at portraying the corruption in the police force of the time. Now, I don't know if the corruption extended to the 1920s, but I'm pretty sure that it did.
It would make sense.
It would, for everything all the chaos that was going on of the time. But in my reading, they also said that a Northern Irish constable or commissioner had come to Birmingham to head the police force to try and stem the violence that was going on there with the gangs. But of course, it didn't work because there's widespread, like, deep-seated corruption in the police force with the gangs, that it's like, they'll get paid off, and then the gang members that were arrested that day would be released that night. So
yeah, I mean, there's a lot of instances of the police making deals with members of the gangs and setting up gangs against other gangs, and it's just a lot.
It's a mess. It's an absolute mess. But for all the show's, like, inaccuracies, because the gangs never went down to London to have dealings with other gangs that were down in London to broaden their enterprise business. They only stayed within Birmingham and the Midlands. I think that it was just, again, another added dose of drama, and what the relationships with other cultures and other ethnic groups. So, like, they have a run-in with the Sicilian gang in London, and they try to make a deal with the Jewish gang in London. We get to see Tom Hardy portray the leader, which I don't know. Did you meet? How far did you get with the series?
I haven't watched until that point, but I did spoil some of it for myself, so I would know.
Okay.
Somewhat of stuff that happened in other seasons, so I do know Tom Hardy's
just watching Tom Hardy in anything he does is amazing, because he's so, like, I don't know, embroils himself in a character. Is that the right word?
Yeah, I think he's also really good at period pieces.
I think
he does a really good job.
Absolutely. So his character role in the Peaky Blinders is really, really good. Really good. He's frightening. And he does it very well.
I look forward to getting to that point.
Yeah. And I mean, just seeing the whole dynamics of, like, how other gangs were how they were ruled, I guess is like a better term, because of how things are portrayed. Just, like, seeing the stark difference is really, really interesting.
Yeah. I think for stuff like that, it doesn't hurt to expand the world of the show, because a lot's happening, between different groups in that time period. So to show that and show, these things aren't only happening in Birmingham, they're happening in different ways elsewhere too. Right.
And around the time when the show is being portrayed, and this happens later, so spoiler.
That's okay.
Spoiler. It's like, then after the whole run-in with, like, this Sicilian gang in London and certain things that happen, we get the mafia from New York, and Adrian Brody comes as the head of the mafia in New York to deal with the Shelby family in Birmingham, and it's just worlds collide.
Yeah.
Because you get the mentality of, like, the new world, as it were, of immigrants who probably weren't doing well in their own country, who have made it big in their new country, then comes back essentially to the old country, though it's not their country of origin, to deal with a gang that had wronged their members of their own gang within, like, before they fled. Yeah, the way they did things was very, very different in dealing with their so-called enemies. It's very, very interesting. It's very, very interesting and thrilling and anxiety-inducing. And so, yeah, big things happen. Big things happen. And I think I believe that's season 4.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
I don't know how much they go into the rest of the seasons too, but at least in season 1, like the IRA plays a bit of a role.
The IRA is definitely the undercurrent of the series because, of course, in the 1920s and into the 1930s, Ireland is trying to get home rule. They don't want to be part of the British Empire anymore because the British Empire was still very much a thing. That really doesn't end until like the mid-1930s or so, if I'm getting my dates correct. I apologize if I didn't. You can comment in the comments if I got that correct or not. Please be kind. So it's where was I going with this? I lost my train of thought then. With the IRA. So it's like they're in season 1, it's like they're just getting their bearings. You've got like Irish gangs in Birmingham and like the other side of town and all this other stuff, and you see their dynamics with the Peaky Blinders. It's like, if you stay on your side of the town and I'll stay on my side, we won't have any problems. But then of course, Grace.
Yeah.
She's a good character, but some of her decisions are rather questionable.
Yeah. And then it also just plays a big role because one of the major issues in season 1 is the guns that the Peaky Blinders stole. And like he threatens the inspector, the police officer. I don't remember his name.
He's a constable.
Sam Neill's character.
Yeah, from Northern Ireland.
Yeah, they always say like, oh, when you're coming from Belfast, so we thought that you would, do more here against corruption, but
Right.
But he makes a deal with him that, if they interrupt his gang activity, then he's going to have the guns sent to the IRA.
Yeah.
And obviously that's something that the English government would want to avoid at all costs.
Oh, yeah,
because
absolutely.
that is something that would threaten their empire. So, like, that's an undercurrent of the season. There's a part of the season where 2 people from the IRA come, because they want the location of the guns.
Right. And it's like Tommy Shelby is, like, playing both sides, which is very, very dangerous in his line of work. But somehow he succeeds in doing it.
Yeah, it's impressive.
Yeah. To have a clever enough brain to even work both sides in such a seamless way is pretty impressive.
Yeah, I don't know if you know how much about, like, because Grace was an undercover
She was
operative.
Yeah.
And, like, I wonder how that must have been pretty common in the time period.
Probably.
I'm not sure.
Yeah, I'm not sure because I didn't really look into it. But I'm pretty sure that if anybody had any type of like violence done to their family that had anything to do with home rule in Ireland of the time, and you were a Northern Irish person and didn't want home rule, that you would then want to try and not allow that to happen. But like, spoiler, it does happen. That's why we have Northern Ireland.
Yeah. But I just found that a very interesting added part.
Yeah, it definitely gives her character more depth instead of just being like the love interest of Tommy Shelby in the series. And I think the only real critique that I have with it is that Grace's character, she leaves Birmingham for New York and then comes back at the middle of season 2, and it's like, what, so you expect to go back to Tommy Shelby? should have stayed. Why'd you leave?
Yeah, well.
Granted, the constable asked her to marry him, and she said no, and it's because she has feelings for Tommy Shelby, and...
But also, it's like, even if she didn't, it's like it came out of nowhere.
It did.
And I could feel her.
Yeah.
Uncomfortable, vibes.
Yes. No, I agree with that, for sure. It was certainly not... Yeah.
Yeah, which I'm sure, was an aspect of the time. You marry men who...
had money.
You just kind of know.
Yeah. Men you knew, men you married. The whole notion of getting married for love now is such a modern concept that back in like the 1920s, and periods before then, you married for protection, you married for wealth, you married for prestige, for at least for the upper class, and to some extent in the middle to lower classes, you married men you knew in your neighborhood. You married for protection, for money. I mean, love is very much a current modern aspect of marriage that it's, I don't know how else to describe it.
Yeah. And I think you see that a fair bit, at least in season 1.
Yeah.
John Shelby gets married, for a political.
Yeah, with the gypsies.
Yeah.
I mean, they're half gypsy too, so that plays a large part of it as well. Because I think because he marries Esme in order, which I love that name. I love that name a lot. In order to prevent a war between the Peaky Blinders and a gypsy family that the gypsy families perceived the Peaky Blinders of doing them insult, and so in order to stem off violence between the two families, they have John Shelby marries Esme.
Yeah. And then they can have, an alliance, to fight. What's his name? Billy Kimber.
Billy Kimball. Yeah. Such an annoying character.
Yeah.
Yeah. And it's so, like, as we've said, that it's interesting that they set the Peaky Blinders show in the 1920s and into the 1930s because in the time, the Peaky Blinders were usurped by another gang with strong affiliations, affirming their political and cultural control in the Midlands. The Birmingham Boys, led by Billy Kimber, would take their place and dominate the criminal scene until they, too, were defeated by another rivalry, the Sabini Gang, who took control in the 1930s. So, effectively, in the 1930s, the Peaky Blinders ceased to exist as the Peaky Blinders. Yeah. And I think it's interesting that we get Billy Kimber in the mix, who was defeated in the show, but had taken over the gang in reality. And then you also hear, and then the Sabini Gang. I believe it's the Sabini Gang, because the name sounds very familiar to me. Is introduced as the Sicilian Gang in London in later seasons of the show, and they're essentially taken over by the Peaky Blinders, when in reality in the 1930s the Sabini Gang takes over the Peaky Blinders that were beforehand taken over by Billy Kimber. So yeah, it's interesting that the show would take their rivals and have them that had essentially thwarted the Peaky Blinders, who had the Peaky Blinders thwart their major rivals in of the time. Yeah,
I mean, it is interesting where these kind of shifted over, the height of their power.
Yeah.
So that, maybe if they'd been at the height of their power in the 1920s, historically, maybe things would have turned out differently.
Yeah.
So it's kind of adding a few different details to see maybe things could change.
Yeah, and I don't know how much of that is like revisionary history though too, which is something that we really have to be careful about as well, because like the whole thing that we talked about with Mary Queen of Scots, which I think which if you haven't seen that episode, you should see that episode. We kind of tear that movie apart because it was awful, but it had an aspect of revisionary history as well. So anyone who isn't really interested, who's only like looking at this as like an entertainment value, which most of the general population are, they're not going to want to actually really go back and look at, like, read about historically what had happened.
Yeah, I read that the creator of the show kind of made it from more of a perspective of stories that he heard from older members of his family.
Oh, interesting.
About what, was going on in the time period.
Right.
And I don't know if he might have said that maybe like a great-grandfather, maybe not even that far, was involved with the Peaky Blinders. So like his secondhand information is what inspired things that happened throughout the show. So maybe it's not completely accurate, but like...
But it's like what they've been told.
Yeah.
That's interesting.
So it could be wrong, but it's the information that was passed down.
That's interesting. So he's really essentially the creator. So this is the creator of the show, is taking personal stories from his own family members, it sounds like, and creating more stories from that, which is really interesting.
Yeah.
Any final thoughts?
No, I think I mentioned everything that I thought we should talk about.
What about you, Joe?
I haven't seen the show, but
after seeing this, would you watch the show?
No, I've been meaning to watch it for a long time.
Oh, you should. Yeah, you should.
Look, all I know is there's going to be a lot of scowling British character actors walking in slow-mo while Nick Cave plays. Can't beat it.
I mean, it's more than that, but yes, you have the general gist of it. But I highly recommend it, especially since the entire series is now on Netflix, and you don't have to wait for any more series to come out. Though Lou was telling us that that even though the show ended, that there's plans for a movie to tie off the entire series. I don't know if he's heard anything more about that, and if he was here, I would have asked. But he's not.
It'll just be left up to, we'll see one day if the movie comes out.
Yeah. Okay. So, I really liked this show. I highly recommend this show. It's brilliantly acted. It's, it's just a really great, entertaining romp through 1920s and 1930s English history that I don't think is really fully portrayed in a while.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, I've really enjoyed what I've seen so far, and it's not normally a show that I would pick up to watch. So, I think in that case, it's pretty good.
Yeah.
And I'm excited to watch more of it.
And the whole Shelby family dynamic is problematic and drama-inducing, and it's just watching them as a family is very entertaining as well.
Yeah.
So, for viewers, I highly recommend this show. Please like and subscribe. Please comment if you're so inclined. And we'll see you next time when we talk about Argo and the 1979 hostage taking in Iran and the Iranian Revolution of 1979. And we'll see you then.
Thank you.
Thank you.